Welcome back. We're going to begin this second hour with a conversation that Carson had with Andrew Root. Professor Root has written one of those books that I'm going to insist that you read. The Pastor in a Secular Age is probably the most influential book on how to pastor in the world that we find ourselves in that's out there in the Christian world right now. And we're really grateful that Professor Root was willing to give us a little time to talk about all the things that have happened since his book came out, and how do we think about it now that the world has changed so much in the last few months. So let's listen into this conversation.
Well, hello all. I'm pleased to be with Dr. Andrew Root today. Andy is a professor at Luther Seminary, where he spends time teaching and writing and researching about youth ministry and practical theology. I'm especially grateful for the work that Andy is doing in practical theology with a deep and a robust understanding of the way in which God initiates work in our world, and for the way in which Andy is doing a critique of our modern context in Western situations. So some of his work recently, The Pastor in a Secular Age, I think reflects well the kind of context we are finding ourselves in. Others of you may know some of his work in youth ministry. Andy, you've got a new book out, The End of Youth Ministry, which I need to get ordered. So, but viewers will want to check out some of your work there. But I want to say thank you for joining me today, Andy.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. In your work, particularly with, I'm thinking of the book, The Pastor in a Secular Age, you spend a lot of time helping you critique our context and begin to ask, what does it mean to minister in this time and space? And I found that very, very provocative. And we've had a little bit of conversation about that a few months ago, but wow, the world has changed. And
yeah, it sure has.
In yet another kind of space over these past 5 months or so. How would you describe the moment we're in? Help locate us.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think we're in the middle of the stream right now. So where we'll be, even by Christmas time, will be hard to tell. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's so exhausting about being in this time is I don't know how it is for other people viewing, but with my own kids, I have a nearly 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, and we don't even know what's going to happen in 4 weeks with school. And everyone keeps deferring, kind of making decisions. And some of that's completely legitimate because we don't know what we don't know for a while. So we're still, I think, in the middle of this, but it's clear to me that things have radically shifted. And as you mentioned, the book, The Pastor in the Secular Age, I mean, one of the reasons I went into that work was just this deep sense of how Charles Taylor was describing what it meant to live in a secular age and thinking about how that really impacts the pastor. And, he's talking broadly, philosophically on what it actually means to what kind of a secular age do we actually live in? And when we say that, what do we really mean? Because it really is true that when anyone says, well, the reason the church is struggling or the issues we have to deal with are because of the secular, we kind of have a sense we know what we're talking about when we say that to each other, but we're not really sure. Of course, Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, gives us 700 pages trying to just get that clear. And as I read that, I felt like, gosh, there's something really relevant to the pastor. And I think the pastor particularly deals with this kind of secular age that he's talking about, this kind of loss of transcendence or divine meaning. And I think it just gets radicalized now inside of a pandemic. I think it even just becomes I think it becomes deeper. I think people feel more disconnected even now from the sources of transcendence as they're locked in their houses, as it feels like they're living in a foreign country when they're living in their own country. And by that, what I mean is I actually had my first official business lunch that I've had since this happened. And it just is weird. Like the waiter comes, we were eating outside, completely social distance, but the waiter comes to the table and you forget. We ordered guacamole, and you were like, well, can you order one guacamole now for two people, or do you have to have individual ones? It felt like, the first time you ever traveled abroad, and you kind of get it, but you don't get it. But now this is our lives. So it's exhausting. And I think it further disconnects us from this sense of being connected to something bigger than us.
Yeah,
And it pulls us deeper into ourselves, I think.
that's good. And in some way, it's not just COVID-19, right?
Mhm.
There are other things that are shifting in our environment right now. How do you perceive that?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't my idea. I think other people have said this, and maybe people even listening to this have other ways to think about this. But somebody said to me that I thought was really true is that we're right now in the middle of three pandemics, if you will, or three big crises. Obviously, we're dealing with a disease that we don't know much about, and as soon as we read one article that says it works like this, then we need to read another one that says it works like that. So we're dealing with just the pandemic in the sense of the virus, but then we're also dealing in my own city, just 3 miles from here. Of course, things changed when George Floyd was killed, and so we're dealing with a moment of reckoning,
Mhm.
and then finally we're dealing with just huge economic fallout. And all of these for the pastor are big enough on their own to deal with. They really are. Maybe broadly the biggest crisis as just one of those that you would deal with in your career potentially, but now you're dealing with all three of them
The
at the
trifecta.
same time. Yeah, you're dealing with. Well, I guess it is really true, right? That things come in threes or whatever they say. Here it is. So
Here we
maybe,
are.
yeah, maybe we can take some hope that a fourth isn't coming. We can cross our fingers and hope, but those are huge challenges, and they do go pre-COVID in the sense of like
Mm.
financial runways for congregations felt short already. Now what? Getting people engaged in kind of the rhythms of faith life felt like an uphill battle. And now, maybe people found new rituals of being online for a while, but most of the pastors that I've talked to, it's starting to dissipate, and the energy they have, as well as the engagement their people have, it's not like it was on the third week of March. That it's a struggle. And now what's going to happen after this? And then of course we've probably deferred, most of us in the kind of primary middle class congregations have deferred a lot of conversations around race and equity and things like that. And now here they are, and you really can't avoid those. And it's really important to wrestle with it. So
Most of the
these are
time.
huge issues,
Yes.
and there's three of them that we have to deal with. If you're leading people, and particularly leading a congregation, they're right there.
Well, we could chase any one of those three pandemics, but uh, let's pull right into the question about the pastor, uh, him or herself. Right there, what's going on with the pastor? Um, they're exhausted, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I live with a pastor. My wife is a pastor of a small Presbyterian church, and so this is dangerously anecdotal. But my experience with talking to a lot of pastors, and I'll go be with some pastors this weekend and have some conversations with them. I mean, it feels like there's more energy to do this. That, I mean, let's face it, no one was trained, or very few people were trained in seminary to run streamed television shows, essentially, or recorded television shows. So you're having the pastor has a huge learning curve here, and you're doing a bunch of things you're not really that good at, or you at least don't have a lot of experience with.
Mhm.
You're asking your youth worker to do all the IT video stuff, which she or he was never really paid to do that. So you're doing that, but then the other thing that I think that you're not getting back, which is really important, is I think most people get into pastoral ministry because of this encounter with persons, this face-to-face encounter, sitting with them,
Right.
being able to speak in front of them, and to preach a sermon and see people's facial expressions and
Mhm.
see the way that words impact people. I mean, especially if you're a Protestant here. I mean, we believe words do something, that particularly words do something. And it's really hard to get that same. I mean, I guess we could just use the German word of Geist. You don't get quite the same spirit back when you're doing it through Zoom, or you're just doing it into a black hole of a little light on your computer screen. So I think that exhausts you. I mean, I think pastoral ministry is always exhausting.
Mhm.
You always come home on Sunday afternoon and fall asleep and take a nap, but you also gut interactions, a touch on the elbow and a look in the eye that says that was really meaningful.
Mhm.
And I think those come a lot less now. I think people are deeply appreciative, but it's hard to get some of that human to human, person to person feedback and to find the energy in that. So, and I think everyone got their energy up for, this is going to be 3 weeks. This is going to be 4 weeks. We can do this.
Right.
And now at 12, 15, 16,
And
it's
frankly,
exhausting.
and we don't see really the end, right?
No,
Well,
no.
I don't want to get too geeky philosophical here, but there's something, not just pastors, but everyone is struggling with a sense of how to have meaning right now. And I know you've been thinking and reflecting about that in recent weeks. You want to explore that a little bit? What happened? We, Pursuing the good life is that's sort of almost an existential reality for being human. But
Yeah.
that's all seemed to be put on hold in some strange ways. Our lives have been put on hold in some
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's really interesting, I think, just broadly about this pandemic is you fear, and it feels like some decisions we'd made even decades before, maybe even multiple decades before this pandemic ever arrived, have not set us up well to deal with this. And I think one of these is just the modern condition, which I try to get at in the pastor in the secular age, that our real challenge as late modern people is that we struggle with having meaning. One of the biggest risks we can find is to find ourselves in a life that we find meaningless, or a worry that we're wasting our lives. And that just wasn't something, say, medieval people worried about. Like you didn't get to create your own meaning, especially as an individual. Very few medieval people sat around and thought, who am I? What does it mean to be me? How can I make my life meaningful? There was just too many other things to concern yourself with. There was just a rich kind of enchanted reality. But since modernity, so for a few hundred years, it's been kind of our job. And as we've gone into late modernity, it's really become the individual's job to create their own meaning. And one of the ways we've dealt with that, and it's worked, I guess we would put it in quotes, well, is that we've tended to defer what gives us meaning and what makes our lives good off to the future. So we tend to think, and especially young adults talk this way, or parents talk about this with their children, that what we're really hoping for our kids is we're getting them involved in all those AAU basketball games. We're sending them to play the piano and to take all those test prep things, because we want them to get into a good school so they can live whatever dream they want to. So the good life becomes a kind of a dream state where we try to accrue resources in the present, have experiences in the present. But the real meaning is often what we'll make with those in the future. So we have kind of deferred the good life off into the future. Now, the problem with the pandemic, and I think this is particularly true with middle class people, is that the real crisis is the future, to be kind of bold and overstated, is over. Like we don't, like you were just saying, like we don't know when it is.
Yeah.
And for sure, we just saw it end quickly. Like you drove your kid all around Texas for 6 years, from one baseball tournament to the next baseball tournament, to one hitting coach to the next hitting coach, to one drama teacher to the next drama teacher, to this choir and that choir. And all of a sudden it just all ended and it was all over. And why were you driving all those miles? Because you were thinking, this
Yeah.
is good for my kid. Maybe she'll get a softball scholarship, or at the very least, it will teach her how to overcome adversity and work on a team. Well, all of a sudden that's all over, and we're just pretty much stuck with the present. And part of the struggle of being a late modern person is we tend imaginatively not to live in the present very much. We're almost always projecting ourselves into the future.
Yeah.
And in some ways, this pandemic has said, nope, you get just the present.
Today
And
is
one of
what
the
you got. Yeah.
Today is what you got, and you got to figure it out. And what does your life mean? What does your life mean as a parent if your job no longer can be to try to get your kid into Yale? Like, and do you want to get your kid into Yale now that it's online and you're going to pay $80,000 a year? It's not that much, but it feels that way. Like, do you really want to do that? Is that now a good life? And what will this world be like after this? What dream could your kid live? I mean, so I think this becomes a little bit of an existential crisis as we're kind of forced to live in the present. Now, I think that also gives us a really interesting angle on what pastoral ministry might be in this time. And I think it is kind of helping people live in the present. And to live in the present, you do need the meaning that comes from practices. I mean, prayer is something you do in the present. Of course, we may pray for the future. Like we pray there might be a vaccine soon. We pray that that the economy will recover in a way that people aren't just massively homeless. We pray for things in the future, but in many ways, you have to get in touch with your body in the present and be in the present. And especially like the mystical traditions, it really is about being in the now and giving the future over to God, but you being in the now and letting God minister to you in the now. And we've tended to use our projection of our dream as the thing that kind of gives us meaning instead of the now and how God meets us within that. So maybe that's a step.
Yeah, so we often use our hope for the future to sort of manage our anxieties and our
Absolutely.
the fears of the moment. But now that's taken away, and so all we're left with is the naked self.
The naked self and the fear of the right now, which is legitimate. And I think that does open up a door for the pastor that people do really need to be ministered to right now.
Yeah,
And they need to really think about what's my life now and how do I care for my kids now and how do I think about what it means to be in this life right now.
That's good. So and so we're back to some basic things, maybe like you've mentioned prayer and to reinvest ourselves in prayer life. That sounds pretty basic, pretty foundational. But what else? How would we spend more time or better time in the present? What does the Christian tradition have to offer us? I wonder.
Yeah. Well, I really do think prayer is a huge one.
Yeah.
And, I end my book, even, pre-pandemic with thinking about prayer is what the pastor teaches people or what the pastor does is teach people to pray. And, one of the main reasons I want to push in that direction is because I think one of the things that can so easily be pulled out of the imagination of the pastor, one of the great temptations of pastoral ministry is to think that your job is to somehow accrue resources to keep the congregation alive, is somehow find some well of relevance that will make you feel good about your own vocation, but also feel good about the church you're leading. And that can be, I think it can be a really dangerous place to be. And I think really what pastoral ministry is about is encounter with the living God.
Mm-hmm.
And prayer it seems so basic and so simple, but
And
it is a real opening to saying what's most important here is that we are encountering a living God. And that's the kind of secular age we live in, is where it's just we have a hard time, even those of us who are deep believers, we don't tend to function out of kind of reflexes of belief. And I think and the pastor even gets, I think, tempted to think, okay, I'm running a small business here. That's what I'm doing in my congregation. And I need to worry about running a small business. And of course, there are elements of that are absolutely congruent with that and make sense. But if that's all it is, then we lose something really central. And at its core, I think the pastor is to witness to, point to, invite people into searching for and encountering a living God. And prayer seems so basic, but it is the disposition in the present that becomes open to that. So that's one. And the other, which is really connected, is storytelling, which is, I know, a very kind of hip thing right now. We see it in the Moth and other NPR things, but we can't undersell how important story is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of our jobs, particularly as we're apart here in quarantine and not able to gather, is how are you helping build a kind of web of narratives and stories with your people? Are there ways to do that? I mean, are maybe having your young people create like super kind of micro podcasts where people in the church tell a 3-minute story about a time in their most meaningful moment when they were 15 years old, or the time they prayed and God spoke to them, or a time they prayed and it felt like they were in a desert and God was absent. And so starting to kind of knit together these narratives, and I think we do have the technology to do that, maybe something we need to really really think about, because at the core, I think the church is a community of persons, and the way we share in each other's lives is through stories and through narratives. And prayer is a narrative, I think, and we can pray our stories, and our stories can pray us in some way. And so maybe we need to attend to that a little bit more. And maybe this time does give us a breath from all the programs and all the necessary kind of programs we needed to run to kind of get to maybe the core of being open to a living God and encountering one another as persons, as opposed to people who show up to events or something like that.
Yeah, a couple of things there, Andy, about that. One is those are both moves to transcendence, right?
Absolutely.
An intentional say, I'm leaning into the tradition in that, and both of those are core practices that are related deeply to each other that help us live more robustly in the present rather than wistfully worrying about the future.
Absolutely. And they're both soaked with meaning. When you hear a story, it doesn't even have to be told well, but a story that really embodies a person, it it feels full of meaning. And you actually helps you think about your own life differently. And praying in the moment, if you really pray, it's no wonder even secular practices are trying to recover something like this, mindfulness
Yes.
practices and things like
Yes.
that, because there's a way that it connects you to yourself and to the world in a way that opens you up to something that really this late modern age tends to discount. And so even secular people are yearning for that. And we have such a rich tradition of living in the present by stopping, talking, and listening to God. And sounds so pietistic, but it's so important, I think.
Well, and isn't that something that pastors could possibly get pretty engaged about, right? To move from always having to do, but to inhabit a different kind of posture within a
Yeah,
community of people and invite others into that kind of
yeah,
posture.
absolutely. And maybe what kind of over really practically kind of is an umbrella over all that and is really hard for us late modern people to deal with. But what we have to do now is just wait.
Yeah.
And waiting is a spiritual practice.
Hmm.
And if we really do believe that God is a living God, and if this God who is a living God that we encounter is the God of Israel,
Hmm.
that the God who arrives, the God who shows up, the God who speaks, the first step to encounter this God is not to do a bunch of stuff. It's not even to make yourself holy and work all your spiritual muscles. It's actually to wait, to be in the
Right.
present and wait,
Yes.
to wait for an arriving God. And so I think in this pandemic, particularly, but even after it, I think the core pastoral practice is to teach a community to wait, to
Yeah.
actually wait for God to show up. And of course, there's all sorts of other work we have to do with thinking, well, how will we be able to discern when it is God who shows up? And it's not just our own psychological constitution or our own need or
Right.
something. And that will take, we need to talk about that. We need to think about that. But the first disposition is really to wait on
Mhm.
God. Because this is a living God who acts and moves and speaks. And Israel waits. That's mainly what Israel does is wait. And then God shows up and God leads.
Yeah.
And in a pandemic, what do we have? One of the things that's so hard for us is you just got to wait.
Yeah.
Maybe in November, maybe in February, we'll have a vaccine.
Mhm.
Maybe we'll be able to open up our economies in a few weeks. Maybe we won't. And waiting's been hard. Waiting's hard for us. It
So, so we
was way
pray.
hard for us
Yeah.
before the pandemic, and it's very much hard.
Yeah. Give us this day our daily bread.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your time today. This is delightful and I think insightful for us as we think about the work of pastoral work in this time and place.